Hello, everybody, and welcome. And I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm really pleased that you could all join us on, well, for those of us in the Northeastern US, Friday night, and for the rest of you folks, I think Saturday morning or Saturday lunchtime. I'm Anissa, and I'll be kind of playing the dual role of a convener, facilitator, and presenting a little bit as well. Yeah, and this is the last session of Liviana. I hope you've all had a really wonderful conference. I think I got to join a few sessions, not as many as I would have wanted to, but there's lots of incredible sessions and generative thinking and connection. And I just want to, shout out to the conveners, the organizers of the conference, for all the work that they've put in behind the scenes to make this happen. Yeah, so this evening, or this final session of Liviana is somewhat of a conversation amongst CERN and non-CERN members who are working on or interested in transforming food governance. We've got a kind of semi-structured format. So I'll start with a little bit of an intro to what the impetus for the session was and some of the ideas that are animating the session. And then I'll hand over to our CERN presenters, to Ethan Miller, Penn Lowe, Kevin St. Martin, who'll share a bit about their work in the region. And then myself, Molly Anderson, and Karen Nordstrom will share a bit about this postdoc project that I've just started and some of the regional work that's already been taking place here in New England. So that sort of the presenting part should get us through maybe an hour, depending on how much discussion we have in between the little presentations. There'll be maybe 7 minutes each. And we can open the floor for comments, questions, reflections after each person. And then the second part of the session will just be more of a conversation, an open dialogue. So feel free to put questions and comments in the chat, and I'll try to keep up with those as well. And yeah, think about what you'd like to share. Okay, before we get started, I just want to situate myself in place and acknowledge that I'm calling in from Burlington, Vermont, and this is part of the unrelinquished lands of the Abenaki people, who I've learned to know it as Winooskik, which means land of the wild onions. And it has been a place of gathering and exchange for a long, long time, shaped by water and stewarded by ongoing generations of Indigenous peoples. And I'm new to this place, but for my part, I'm committed to working in solidarity to undo colonial legacies of dispossession and marginalization, and to learn how to live in right relationship with this land and the beings who inhabit it. So let's work together here to open up the conversation. So what was the impetus for the conversation? The session title is Transforming Regional Food Governance in the Northeastern US, a conversation about participatory action research. I put the research in brackets because when we were in the process of organizing this session, a few folks said, I don't really do PAR in the traditional sense. And so there was an interesting bit of discussion about what are we doing? Are we doing PAR? Are we doing something else? I'm sure we'll get into that a bit later. But I think I wanted to invite folks to come and have a conversation because, as many of you know, I've just moved here to start a new postdoc project at the University of Vermont's Institute for Agroecology. And the project is framed around this idea of transforming regional food governance in New England through PAR methodologies. We'll talk a bit more about that project later on. So the idea was to bring together our project team. So that's me, Colin Anderson, who unfortunately couldn't make it and, sends his regrets and his regards, Karen Nordstrom and Molly Anderson, who you'll hear from a bit later, with folks in CERN, of course, Ethan, Penn, Kevin, Boone, who unfortunately couldn't make it, but I think his spirit is kind of in the room with us. And then I'm obviously part of CERN, and Colin is as well, although he hasn't been super active yet. I think he's keen to be. And really, it's about just having an exchange and exploring some synergies and possible areas for collaboration. So I'm really grateful that everyone was willing to have this chat and to come together, and we're hoping it'll spark some generative threads of further inquiry. So there's a few key words in this title that, there's a lot of different words in there. So what are we really talking about? And I'm not aiming to define anything here. I think it's open for conversation, but I just wanted to frame it up a little bit so that we have a sense of what are we talking about? We're talking about governance. So, it's pretty open. It could be a lot of different things, but in the broadest sense, we're talking about maybe the institutional arrangements which shape different kinds of decision making. Power is in there, the exercise of authority or power, or very simply, the process of organizing the conduct of conduct. There can be some other, it would be great to hear other people's ideas about what governance means to you. And then transformation, in this context of the food systems context, for me personally, and what I kind of, in my dissertation was thinking about was the process through which ways of thinking, feeling, and doing governance, doing food governance, might be made more democratic and responsive to public concerns for equity, ecological stability, and justice. Could put some other things in there as well. So what might transformation look and feel like in this particular context, in the Northeastern US? And probably, well, some of these things will be applicable beyond this particular context, but for sure, transformation is about going beyond some kind of technical intervention to really confront unjust political and economic regimes that are locking colonial, imperial, and neoliberal food systems in place. So we might think about this, and I love Penn, yours and Boone's paper, Fight and Build, and that idea that we are these things are really interrelated, that we're taking apart and we're working to contest oppressive systems and structures and relations, and we're also building and reformulating. And it's not like one thing is over here and the other thing is over here. They fit together and they're part of the same set of actions often. But what that looks like in place is really a question for iterative collective reflection, embodied learning, and ethical action. It can't be, thought about outside of a context. We'll come back to this later, but I just wanted to briefly, no, that's it actually. Sorry, that is coming later. So that's it from me for now. And, that is really what the conversation is going to be about today. So to start us off, I'm going to invite Ethan to the floor and invite him to introduce himself and tell us what he's going to share with us today. You don't have slides, but I guess I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Ethan, just so we can see each other. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Anissa. Really great to be here with you all. It's the end of a long week and a long day, so and I'm doing a little bit of improvisation, so bear with me, but I'm really happy to see dear old friends and new folks who hopefully will become dear old friends. So I'm Ethan Miller, he, him. I'm a settler descended person living in unceded Wabanaki homelands, colonially known as Maine. We often like to call it Wabanaki/Maine. I am an activist scholar, focused in my research life on ecological and solidarity-based alternatives to the economy. That's how I'm thinking about it right now. I'm a farmer. I grow fruit trees with a worker cooperative called Wild Mountain Nursery. And I've lived for the better part of 24 years in a cooperative community called Wild Mountain Cooperative, with a few side excursions in grad school, thanks to some of you on this call. And I think probably most relevant for the panel, I'm a co-creator and now co-coordinator of Land in Common, which is a community land trust here in Wabanaki that's focused on land justice and restoring reciprocal land relationships. We talk about it as land for life, livelihood, and liberation. And we work really closely with Wabanaki organizations and nations on land return and and really centering decolonization efforts at every level, both in the work that we're doing, but also kind of in wider conversations around food systems and land protection. Um, and then the majority of the rest of our energy is really focused on creating permanent land connections with and for Black and Brown and non-Wabanaki indigenous communities, and especially with organizations that are really focused on collective liberation in various ways. So a big part of this is connecting communities with land for farming, for medicine, for craft production, food systems and livelihood systems really broadly, like direct access to the means of life. Um, and we do this through a community land trust model, which the way we think about that is really about decommodification of land, really about taking land out of capitalist relations, out of market relations, and bringing it into a community governed commons. And so currently we have 5 locations in 3 different counties. On those locations, I think there are about 9 different projects. We've got a nonprofit community mutual aid vegetable farm that's distributing. I think they just said they distributed 36,000 pounds of food at zero cost out to communities. And we've got 3 worker cooperative farm businesses, an emerging agroforestry project that's going to be weaving natural burial caskets out of willow grown on the land. And then we also hold, I mean, we have an affordable housing cooperative with a bunch of folks living there, and that's where I live. And we also are holding a bunch of farmland that we haven't yet allocated. And I think that's like a piece of I think what I'll get into here in thinking about governance. So yeah, I was intrigued by this idea of governance. And so I think I'll maybe focus on that and then come around to the question of research. Um, so governance, particularly as it relates to land, and I sort of when I say land, I'm really thinking of water as a part of land, like really using land as kind of a placeholder for the place-based relations that sustain us. Um, and so yeah, I really resonate, Anissa, with the broad frameworks that you started with. I mean, thinking about governance, people often think about government, and then people often immediately go to policy. Um, and I don't think that's wrong or bad. I mean, those are really important things to focus on. But you know, I know that I'm not alone, and this is where your is at too, in wanting to think about governance much more broadly. I think there's a danger that we get into sort of like the state equivalent of capitalocentrism, which would be like the statocentrism, where we think the state is the only place where governance happens, and um, and the only place where some equivalent of law happens. And so I'm really interested in thinking of governance as kind of the processes by which collectives make ourselves in relationship to each other, and then more specifically, how do we make decisions? How do we set priorities? How do we establish rules and agreements? How do we enact accountability and enforcement? It's really like, how do we make worlds together? And so we do that in lots of different ways. There's a whole diverse landscape. I think markets are a mode of governance. I think commoning and commons is, I mean, or maybe not a mode, but like marks out a whole sort of array of different modes that we can think about. Um, and so, yeah, so when we think about food systems governance, then, I think it's like, yeah, it's about state policy, but it's also about the enterprises that produce and store and transport and distribute food. It's about governance of the different collective forms that through which we organize and use food, through which we transform food into our bodies, into energy, into waste. And I think it's also importantly, and this is really what I want to focus on, is the ways we organize access to the means of creation. And so I think a lot about governance of how do we govern the appropriation of habitat? So habitat as our life-sustaining relations, land is a way to talk about that. The relationship of appropriation is really like, how do we make habitat our own? What are the ways that we format those relations and make decisions around those relations? And so, um, in traditional Wabanaki ontology, and this is true for many animist ontologies, um, including probably those of my own before the sort of monotheistic colonialism took it over. But the appropriation of habitat takes the form of reciprocal kinship relationships. So belonging to a community, a collective that includes the land and its more than human inhabitants. And in that situation, then governance emerges as a multi-species process of accountability and reciprocity. Then in contrast, in European colonial ontologies, the appropriation relationship first renders habitat as a collection of objects to be used or discarded or stewarded. Natural resources really captures it as a term. And you don't have reciprocal relationships with things. We use resources, we don't relate with them. We're not accountable to them. So then governance begins from a radically different place. It's a process where only humans participate. And the best thing we can do is get data about how to, efficiently use our natural resources. And then what that also means is that only some humans actually participate really in that governance because those objects really quickly become property and the property has owners. And that whole relationship of ownership, I think, is a crucial site of governance, or it's a gatekeeping mechanism for governance. Um, Objects belong to us. We don't belong to a community, in which the land is a part. Um, and so I think I just see the ways that our food system governance unfolds so much in this context, in this culture that worships private property and sees private property as sort of the end all and be all of security, of livelihood possibilities, of policy interventions. Um, and I think that, as weird as it is and like unsettling as it is to really try and look at that relationship and unsettle it, I think it's really important. In food systems work, there's so much talk about land access lately, um, but I really don't see that talk pushing far enough beyond land access to really think about what are the ontologies that are formatting what land is to us in the first place, and what's the work that we're doing to open up more space to radically reimagine what the terms of that access look like and how that transforms who we're even in relationship with. Um, and so that's really where our work with land in common. And I know I'm running up against time, so I'll wrap it up. Um, but land in common is really just one experiment among many to try and explore, like, how do we build a different kind of relationship with land that doesn't move through the private property relationship. And of course, we have a deed for the land, but we're trying to also think about, like, how does that deed sort of get hollowed out? How do we use that as sort of a smoke screen that faces the state, but then facing our communities, we're building a totally different kind of relationship with the land, very much led by Wabanaki priorities and communities, but also um, really seeking a non-appropriative way of relating to that work. So many questions that are unfolding all the time. It feels like the entire project is a research project. Like, if we don't allocate land through market relations, how do we do it? Like, we haven't figured that out. We're having huge conversations across a very multiracial, cross-class group of people about what a different kind of land allocation system might look like. And how do we do that in the context where the land is stolen? And so many communities have been dispossessed and dislocated onto this land, and how to negotiate, how to build solidarity across that and not set it up as a kind of divide and conquer. So I'll end there, and I know we have time for conversation. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much, Ethan. It's, yeah, really beautiful and powerful framing to start with, and raising some, yeah, really fundamental questions. I think I want to open it up to the floor, just if anyone's got anything they want to say now. You might just be thinking and absorbing, but feel free to jump in. I can't see everyone on my screen, so please just unmute yourself and jump in if there's anything you want to say, reflect, ask. We'll have more time for discussion. Okay, I don't see anybody with a burning question. All right, I'm going to pass over to Pen. Please introduce yourself, tell us what you're going to talk about, and I think you have some slides, so go ahead and share your screen.
Yeah, actually, I saw Molly's hand go up. So, Molly, did you want to?
Sorry, I missed that. Molly, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and thanks, Penn, for noticing that. The computer noticed it even sooner than you did, uh, and raised a little hand for me as soon as I stuck my hand up. But I was just saying that in Ethan's presentation, I really resonated with that idea of going beyond private property, which of course is one of the absolute fundamentals of capitalist society. And I see what you're trying to do as post-capitalist livelihoods, post-capitalist ways of organizing ourselves. So I'm quite interested in that.
Thanks, Molly.
Beautiful. Thanks, Pen, for noticing, and thanks, Molly, for that. Is there anybody else who wants to jump in right now? Or? Okay, I think that's a no. So, Pen, I'm going to hand it over to you. Please go ahead.
All right. Well, thanks, Anissa, for organizing us. And I could always sit around and listen to Ethan talk for another hour or two. But so appreciate, Ethan, you sharing all of that. But I'm sitting here at home. I am located on unceded Massachusetts land. In Cambridge, Massachusetts right now, but I teach at Tufts University in the Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning Department. We are a professional master's program in urban planning and public policy. And I've been there since 2009. And I came into this work not as I guess I'm not trained as an academic. I come out of community-based environmental justice work, and ran into, I guess, Boone Shear, who you already mentioned, is someone I met when we were both involved with organizations that were part of a green jobs campaign statewide in Massachusetts back in 2009, those years. And I guess I'll maybe say that, since I've been at Tufts teaching and connecting students with, all kinds of projects, and, my role in the department has really been to be a bridge between the department and the community and movement work that I was involved in. I have both run into a lot of community economies work, and that was because we kind of got brought in the direction of how do we not just fight for policies that would, get government to do the things that we, give the communities needed, like green jobs, but could we create our own green jobs? And could we start to create our own green economy? And what would that look like? And what kinds of ideas would be behind that? And of course, solidarity economies and community economies have been super informative and helping us to do that work. So I guess what I'm going to share today is really a little bit of a snapshot of something that it was a part of a story I was able to tell, actually starting about 10 years ago, when a lot of our concern in the work that we were doing was about making visible the actual economic economies that already existed, and practices that were already kind of going beyond the not completely captured by by capitalism. And a lot of that early work that we were able to point to was actually in the food space. I didn't necessarily come into this work with any particular I guess, attachment or kind of thinking about, oh, food is food systems and food is the place to go. But it is actually a place that a lot of the community partners that I work with actually ended up in. And so I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell, just a snapshot. I'll just say up front, this is what I'm doing is partly a performance that I've done many times now, to say that a alternative food solidarity economy actually exists. And we were very conscious that the work, when we started to do this work, telling those stories was in part trying to help this whole emerging ecosystem of activities to continue to grow and connect. And maybe I'll just say a little bit going towards my closing thoughts, which is that as we were continuing to navigate, and Anissa opened up with this idea of fight and build, right? So that we were kind of in the fight, oftentimes with government and around policy, and trying to build and create more space and resources to build our alternatives. But as we've come to see our work more as worlding, and that even our own constructs and ideas about governance and the state and what an economy was were all kind of captured in some ways into kind of this colonial, modernist capitalist construct that we anyway, those are a lot of my work today is more around understanding some of those tensions and in fact sometimes contradictions, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but let me do a little performance first for you around what the Boston food economy, solidarity economy has been. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, are folks seeing my screen right now? Okay, good. And I've got, all right, so Boston's food solidarity economy in the food sector. All right, so as I said, about 10 years ago, we were starting to tell this story. This graphic is from a Yes Magazine article that I was able to write about this food system. And this is a nice graphic that just shows how different types of alternative economic practices and vehicles were growing in all parts of the food system. And I'll just kind of go around the circle here. It starts with the land, and through collective ownership and community land trusts. There's all kinds of growing urban agriculture that were happening on that land and other land. Some of that produce was finding its way into food processing businesses, as well as retail and restaurants. And that a lot of what otherwise would have been waste was being collected and repurposed through a worker cooperative to turn that organic waste back into soil. So this kind of gives you a sense of all the different ventures that have been started or that have been happening. And I'll just say a little bit more about each of those pieces. A lot of folks may have heard of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which is a planning and organizing group in Boston's Roxbury and Dorchester neighborhoods that achieved a lot of fame because in the 80s, when they started out, they were able to both start a community land trust as well as gain through their political struggles the right to, they got delegated the power of eminent domain, so the power that the state has to take private land. And they use that to assemble 30 acres now that are part of their community land trust. And since the late 80s, so now close to 35 years, getting close to 40, they have done what they have called community control over development. And you can see that in this neighborhood that in the 80s had just swaths of vacant land because of disinvestment and because folks were, trying to leave the neighborhood and would, there were many arson for insurance money schemes so that owners could escape. But the Dudley Street neighborhood, a lot of their founders are in that top right photo. And that's a big swath of land, which is now the same land is depicted in the lower right. So collective ownership of land through the community land trust is at the beginning of this cycle. The growing happens in a lot of different ways. So again, look, even 10 years ago, there were both for-profit, nonprofit, and neighborhood-based efforts to do growing. I'll start with the bottom left. It actually is a youth-led effort called Grow or Die that came out of the environmental justice organization that I was a part of called Alternatives for Community and Environment. And those youth were inspired by efforts that they had heard about in Detroit through a US social forum, where folks were recovering vacant land and turning it back to productive use through community gardens. So they said, we have lots of vacant land in our neighborhood too, and we like the idea of just going out there and not asking for permission from anyone, the state or the landowners, and we're just gonna work with the neighbors to build raised bed gardens and put that land back into productive use with the stewardship of neighbors growing food on it. So that was guerrilla gardening. In the top left was an effort called City Fresh Foods. That was actually a for-profit commercial urban farming venture where they were growing high-value crops on small plots of vacant land wherever they could find it, and trying to prove that commercial farming could be viable in the city. They were backed by what is now the Urban Farming Institute of Boston, which is a nonprofit farmer apprentice and school, and which now also has its own community land trust, so that their farmers can go onto land that is decommoditized. And then finally, there's a lot of there's a community greenhouse and urban farm that's run by the Food Project, which is a nonprofit youth development program that brings together young people from the city and the suburbs to develop leadership together through growing. All right, so some of this food made its way to different food processing. There's been several different ventures that have been trying to help support and incubate food businesses. I'll point to the left-hand side of the screen right now. City Fresh Foods, that's a picture of Glenn Lloyd, who started City Fresh Foods back in the early 1990s. He had been a high school teacher who realized he couldn't do so much to help his students by just staying in the classroom. So he said, what students really need are good jobs and opportunities to do that if they don't go to college. So he started City Fresh Food, which is a catering firm that provides culturally appropriate meals to all kinds of different institutions. And when they wanted to source more locally grown produce, they found that they couldn't find much. So Glenn was amongst the folks who really helped build a movement here to get, first of all, get urban farming zoned. So it became legal through the zoning process. That took a whole campaign. Glenn was also the one behind that City Growers for-profit venture that you saw, as well as the Urban Farming Institute. And then on the right-hand side is Commonwealth Kitchen. This is a food business incubator that has a shared kitchen. It converted a former hot dog factory and now has a shared kitchen where over 150 businesses have been launched out of that space with a focus on people of color and women entrepreneurs. And they have become, again, a pretty important part of the food system here in the Boston area. My favorite part, of course, is the eating. And so food shows up in spaces where people can eat it. The Haley House Bakery Cafe on the left here, it actually came out of a soup kitchen that established a bakery, and their space has become a wonderful, classic third space of vibrant community meeting spot. And they also have a job training program for both young people and formerly incarcerated folks in baking and catering. And they're one of the places that likes to source a lot of their stuff locally as well. And then the Dorchester Food Cooperative is a food cooperative that started organizing itself more than 12 years ago to become a food co-op that could actually serve the very diverse neighborhood, both racially and economically, and overcome some of what had become with food cooperatives, serving a more wealthy clientele. So they actually just opened up their physical store, which you see in the bottom right, just the summer of 2023. So it was a long journey for them to actually get a store open. And then finally, at the end of this is the Cerro Co-op, which is a co-op that came out of workers with two different worker centers, Black and Latinx workers predominantly, and who were looking to create their own green jobs back from that green jobs era. And they found out that there were new opportunities to do this type of work because, again, through some of the environmental campaigns, we capped our landfills, so we couldn't put any more into them, and we needed to divert especially organic waste and move that over so that it could be repurposed through composting. And so Cerro was born. And they've been operating for the last 10 years and now have contracts with a lot of those businesses that I just showed you, as well as other big institutions, including some grocery stores and universities. So that is kind of the story I wanted to tell. That's just give you a snapshot of, and we can talk a lot more about the challenges and ups and downs of how this has all evolved over the last 10 years, but it is a even more prominent and identifiable kind of sector now than it was even 10 years ago. And I'll just leave with some thoughts around some of the contradictions, tensions, challenges. And I'll talk about this Garrison Trotter Farm. So this is one of those sites that, because we won the right to have commercial farming in the zoning code, the city was then able to turn some of its vacant land out for development into urban farms. Garrison Trotter was one of them. The Boston Farms Community Land Trust, which is the land trust associated with the Boston Urban Farming Institute, now operates this farm. And it was a great success from a lot of perspectives, not only because this was a partnership that involved city, but also large nonprofits like the Trust for Public Land provided a lot of the startup capital that was necessary to convert the land to be farmable. The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative took over the land on behalf of the Urban Farming Institute until it could launch its own CLT, which it now has today. And I guess the point of contradiction here is that even though you could say now that the land is decommoditized, it has made more possible the idea that someone could farm in the city and make a living in selling to the markets that exist today. They can only do that because the food is not decommoditized. Food remains a commodity. It's not lost amongst the folks who do this work that if they want the urban farmers to make a good living, which they do, it's because they're able to sell the greens and herbs and produce like that to high-end supermarkets and very expensive restaurants that will pay a premium for that. So here's I think so decommodifying land is just part of the picture, but not the complete. And I should note that all of those farmers who do this work, it's not purely commercial mode that they're in. They all do different forms of gifting and providing space and food for different types of programs and things like that. So it is much more than just commercial farming that's happening on that land. But a lot of questions come up around scale. How can you do more of this? How can you do more of this in a way that isn't co-opted and mainstreamed into the system as it is, because you're accountable now to investors or government. How do you do this in competition with other capitalist enterprises in capitalist markets? And then, this is the question that increasingly we've been trying to work on with folks is, how do we shift away from this capitalist mindset where all we end up caring about is growth, jobs, and individualized wealth? So I am going to stop sharing screen right now because I've probably gone on long enough. And, I'll just maybe finish by saying that, in this kind of fight and build model, I think we've learned that using some of the so-called master's tools, whether that's, finance or policy, has been very useful and has made certain things possible and has also posed some limits and constraints on the work that we're doing, which is why there has been also then now folks that are trying to develop solidarity financing. And there's been a lot of that that's been happening so that we're not as reliant on conventional capitalist finance markets. And there are folks that are trying to work more on policy as well. But again, lots of questions about, how do you do that in ways that aren't entirely encoded into the kind of private property regime that the state is in large part set up to create and protect. And so, navigating some of these challenges using the tools of governance has been tricky and will continue to be, but people are continuing to try. And I think that's part of what the worlding process is about is like, when you meet barriers on one end, are there ways you can go beyond or already are? And how do you lift those up? And what can we take with us from kind of this world into the other ones that we're trying to cultivate?
Thanks so much, Penn. Yeah, it's like really complex and like interesting things to think about with all the different dynamics, with the self-governance of the community land trust, but it's also its embeddedness in all these other tools and technologies and regimes of governance that how do you work across those worlds and through those worlds and still forge like your values and put your ethical principles into practice and how that's getting done. So really interesting. Thanks so much. Does anyone have any burning comments, questions, reflections? Yeah, Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Penn, and thanks, Ethan. I think I'd love to come back to this question of decommodification of the food along with the land, because I think there is a lot of decommodified food circulating in what we might call a community food web. We've never really documented it, but it could be documented. But there's also a lot of food that's circulating and being distributed through what we might call alternative markets, where there is some kind of solidarity price being set that isn't the pure market price that's going to Whole Foods or something. So I think we could do a lot more work at trying to parse the kind of new economy of distributing less commodified food, if not. I mean, I guess we can also define how you're going to talk about commodified. Yes, food could be exchanged for money, but it could be done so under very different ethical conditions than the ones that pertain to selling it to a niche, market. But anyway, it just seems like there would be there's some interesting kind of statistics that could come out when we start to actually document how much non-commodified food is actually being produced and consumed in the world, but certainly even in so-called advanced capitalist countries or former Eastern Bloc, where we had a big discussion the other night about all the domestic food production that's going on. So I think there's some really interesting issues there because what would be the kind of constraints or what would be the enabling policy regimes to allow more non-commodified food to be produced? And it could have something to do with food regulations, like UNA's research has shown. Obviously the zoning and all these, you're pointing to lots of points of intervention here, which would be lovely to kind of unpack a bit more, but fantastic. Thanks very much. Got me thinking.
Thanks, Catherine. Molly, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I've really struggled with this too. how we can move to a solidarity economy, yet farmers can still make an income. And one of the things that's being discussed in Vermont, not at the state government level, but at the NGO level, is creating a plan for a universal basic income for farmers so that they could receive what they need in order to produce the food that we need. Thanks.
Thanks. I see Pen. Did you want to respond to what Catherine said?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I was just going to say I have to start including that part of the story in my telling, because I just realized I left that out because I was trying to highlight the tension and challenge. But you're right. There's a whole nother side to the story, and we have to. Anyway, I have to remember to lift that up because in other settings we have.
Thanks, Stephen. I see a hand up there. Go for it.
Yeah, just a quick appreciation for what Kath and Molly was saying. That, you know, what UBI means for me is that on some level, like the problem of solving access to food might not be solved within that sphere, but by a redistribution of income from somewhere else. And likewise, it seems to me that the Belo Horizonte example, which is basically the state setting aside land for food production that satisfies the needs of low-income folks in that context, would be another point of intervention that where the state could play an enabling role, either in directly subsidizing the income of farmers or subsidizing access. So it seems to me there's lots of ways to produce a market that operates under a different logic, in addition to decommodifying food.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Any responses to that? And I see Abby put something in the chat. Did you want to jump in at this point? Or does anyone want to respond to Stephen? You've gone horizontal on my screen. Oh, no, you're back. Abby, did you want to come in? No. Okay. All right. Anybody else? I mean, I will say something quickly. So yesterday we had Anna Rudolph, who's at Wageningen in the Netherlands, and who's been visiting down at UMass with Penn and Boone. She came up and did a session at the IFA, the Institute for Agroecology, on agroforestry in the Netherlands. And she's a PhD candidate. She just finished her extensive ethnographic field work. And she was explaining that the Dutch government is hugely subsidizing agroecology now. There are about 231 official agroforestry initiatives. Well, they're called food forests, and they have a very particular definition. Agroforestry, she was saying, is a much broader term that includes lots of different things, but the Dutch government is specifically subsidizing food forests. 231 on the books, but she noted that there are hundreds more that are not officially recognized. So that's just to, reinforce Kath's point about how much is undocumented. And the Erosion Technology and Concentration Group, which is an international research organization that has talked and written about the peasant food web, has also said that globally we have no idea how much decommodified food or differently exchange, under different exchange relations, food is being circulated, and it is actually what sustains the food security of most of the planet. So I think, really, really important to think about that more. Anybody else want to jump in right now? If not, I'm gonna pass over to Kevin. All right, Kevin, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin St. Martin. I'm faculty at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I'm going to read 2 pages, and I apologize for that. I was like writing down a bunch of notes, trying to think of something smart to say about governance, and then I realized I wrote what I always write, and so those of you who know me are not going to get anything new, I'm afraid, but it'll at least be written and coherent, so it'll be quick, and then I'll show a few slides of a current project that I'm working on, and maybe that'll be interesting. So let me just dive in with based on some of the prompts that you sent us, thinking about transformation and what it might mean, right? And I was thinking that transformation in my work really means creating a world where more than capitalist fishing enterprises and systems of seafood distribution can survive and thrive, right? So thinking, think community-supported agriculture, but in the tune of community-supported fishing, right? Is how can we create worlds where that can survive? And this is super important insofar as since the 1990s, fishing and marine resources are increasingly privatized and commercial fishing is increasingly industrial, corporate, and consolidated. Such a stance toward transformation is aligned with, I think, this idea, certainly in the world I come from, fisheries social science, with saving small-scale fishing. That's often how you tend to think of these things. And the latter, small-scale fishing, has much going for it. It foregrounds community and livelihood over individualized accumulation. It foregrounds commons over privatization of fish and access to fish, right? I like to think of small-scale fishing as a set of practices that enact an ethical commitment to community and commons. So I'm kind of appropriating small-scale fishing and turning it into this ethical idea that resonates actually with a lot of fishing communities. So to be clear, transformation is not about preserving a particular past economic and ecological formation, right? Rather, it's about learning from those past and present small-scale fishing enterprises and practices. What do? I ask in my work, what are the specific and varied processes and practices that inform small-scale fishing? What are their relations of production and distribution? How do they enact community and environmental well-being? What's the ethical dispositions and so on and so forth, right? So transformation for me in that kind of a work really emerges from a reading for difference, which is probably not a surprise, but a reading for difference in search of new foundations for future fishing, right? This is how I kind of try to think about it. And if small-scale fishing is an ethical stance, that can be performed anywhere, right? How can we imagine a world where small-scale fishing can be performed anywhere? Okay, but how does that relate to the question of governance as a site of such transformation? I was trying to think like, okay, governance, and in particular in the Northeast of the United States, which is where my work largely is along the coast from here in New Jersey on up to the Canadian border. First, just a few words about governance and what it looks like right now, right? In short, governance of fisheries professes an ontology of single stocks of fish existing within a defined management area, right? And these stocks of fish can be counted. It also professes a singular and individualized fisherman who is driven to accumulate like any other good Homo economicus, but who is problematically hampered by the fact that the oceans are common property. So the hegemonic mode of governance built upon those ontological foundations really is all about working toward privatization and marketization of marine resources. That's sort of this notion of foundations is incredibly important to where I'm going. So basically, fisheries governance revolves around now a cap and trade approach, right, that we're all familiar with in governing carbon globally. And that cap and trade approach is being institutionalized pretty much wherever you can successfully count fish and count fishermen's efforts, right? Those are the two sort of building blocks that allow us to produce this kind of cap and trade logic. So within this mode of essentially what I would argue at the level of government, right, there are varying levels of participation and democracy, public forums and industry advisory boards, traditions of relatively open science and management that is increasingly, however, technocratic, driven by algorithms and lots of computing. And in so doing is getting increasingly post-political. And this I'm speaking from 20 plus years of experience in the Northeast of the United States. But I would argue, so with that shift, how do we engage in transforming governance, right? And I would say that I start from this idea that governance is a word that lets me think about more than just government, right? Lets me think about more than just federal and state agencies that set up things like the New England Fisheries Management Council. The council is a council that of appointed specialists and fishing industry people who construct law around how and when you can catch fish. In addition to those kind of bodies and agency-driven organizations, it's also the science, the technologies, the measurements and mappings, the very metrological infrastructure that supports and frames what is possible in terms of management. That those councils, they only work insofar as they have this infrastructure. Indeed, there's another committee that's related to that big council called the Science and Statistical Committee. And that committee draws together the best available science that tells them about fish stock and fishermen's behavior. And, I just got lost. And that committee actually determines the cap in a cap and trade logic system. As a result, that committee directly shapes economic possibility, determines distributions and consolidations of value and profit. I've been a member of that committee for over 10 years, just to put myself out there as a neoliberal actor. So I've, over that length of time, I've witnessed, arguably, how neoliberal capitalism emerges, how it takes hold, and how it's made durable over and over and over again. And it's clear to me that it is as much about scientific categories, analytics, and metrological foundations as it is about any neoliberal sensibility or even policy itself. In short, you can think neoliberalism, resource management, and economy all you want, but it cannot be achieved and made durable without an ongoing investment in highly specialized and constraining metrics and maps. Okay, so where am I going with my ideas for transformation, right? Where do I think transformation can happen? I think transformation in my work looks like the hard work of building with others through participatory action projects a rival metrology, right? Enacting an ontological politics meant to struggle with and against a system that currently can only produce consolidation in corporate ownership and an ongoing existential threat to small-scale fishing. So for me, this has meant a really multi-year project, many years now, of producing maps and data that make concrete two things: community and commons. You might think that such objects already exist, and they do exist in common parlance, in culture, in sentiment, even in the media. But they do not exist in the metrological foundations of fisheries science and management. They are not a site or aspect of governance, and their non-existence constrains any attempt to use them as a foundation upon which to build other fishing futures, right? It's highly constraining that possibility, I would argue. So I just want to give you a slide of what our work looks like. I'm going to show you what community and commons looks like from a rival metrological perspective that's meant to be used by and influence this kind of dominant regime of fisheries science and management. And let me just share my screen. Can you see the slide that says change in port activity? No. No,
we can't see it yet.
You can't see the slide. Oh, unfortunate. Okay, let me try something else. Did that do anything?
Nope.
No. Okay.
I think
Sorry.
we need
Can
to
you
make
just?
Kevin a host in order to be able to share. So let's make you a co-host.
Oh.
I don't think that's
try it now.
Okay, I'll try it again.
Never know.
Penn was able to do it, so.
Oh, that's right.
Strange.
Penn did it without being a co-host.
Yeah.
It kind of says you can see it, even though you can't.
Sometimes you have to do it twice. You have to go share screen, and then you have to select the screen that you're sharing. Yeah.
Hey.
There we go.
Thank you. Like I haven't been doing this for 15 years or something. Okay, there we go.
Great.
Good. Okay. Okay, so that's a slide that's showing us community. You might not realize that, but what it is, and to explain the column on the left, the colorful, really pretty one of my favorites, every row in that graph is a community, which is to say a bunch of data that was drawn from the log books of peer groups of vessels that come from the same port, that go back to the same port, that fish together, that know each other. This is all based on all kinds of participatory stuff, that go to the same places in the ocean, that have that live under the same constraints and opportunities, let's put it that way, of their peer group of vessels. And so if you look at, oh dear. There, can you see that circle that I just put on? Okay, so that circle is captures several of these peer groups of vessels, and these all belong and land in Newburyport, Massachusetts. So these are lobster group, the group of lobstermen, a group of small-scale trawlers, a group of gill netters, and you can see the activity year by year is in color. And the more intense the color, the more activity year by year. And of course, what you see is on the left-hand side, early in the time series, plenty of activity, and as move to the right, activity declines precipitously, and then you have just nothing but gray, which is to say there's virtually no activity recordable or reported to the National Marine Fisheries Service. I keep pressing the wrong key. The graph on the right-hand side is a statistical index of the diversity of the fleet for the entire port, and it's basically saying that port just got less and less diverse, fewer and fewer peer groups of vessels. If you look at this is Gloucester, Massachusetts, a very famous, quite large port, really historically important for fishing. Lots of activity by lots of different peer groups in Gloucester, Massachusetts. It looks like there's a lot going on still compared to early in the time series. But if you look at the Simpson Index of Diversity, diversity is declining. It's simply saying, yeah, there's still activity, but it's getting more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer peer groups of vessels over time. And if you look at this data for I'm sorry, I have this data for the entire Northeast of the United States, and it's become really desirable to a lot of this development of impact analyses for various offshore endeavors like wind energy and conservation and a whole range of spatial planning and so on. And this is, I can't tell you how novel this is to so many people, despite whatever, they just don't look at the data this way. So they don't constitute a community presence through the very data they have. They simply aggregate it differently by state and by other metrics. This is community in a rival metrological sense, and the data shows lots of decline, which is now becoming really useful, important, again, kind of desirable to the agencies that are now mandated to account for environmental injustices, because one of the ways you can talk about justice is about an unevenness of the results of management. And what you see in this data is tremendous uneven impacts in any management policy. Basically, coastal Maine, just many communities just disappearing off of the maps that we make. So that's community. Commons looks more like this. You know, again, this is really statistically driven. This is median trend analyses mapping of where these boats go in the ocean and then change over time. Again, really interesting data when you're thinking about impact analyses for wind energy and so on. And in fact, people like the Nature Conservancy want this data because they're very interested in building these data portals. On the right-hand side here, you see the Gulf of Maine, and Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, New York City in the bottom left. And in the Gulf of Maine, you see this orange form. That's where they're leasing rights to wind energy. And so the Nature Conservancy is all about, like, you know, rationalizing that leasing practice. They're pro wind energy, but they want it done right, you know, this kind of stuff. And so there's just tons of data that they put into these kind of mapping portals, and they actually working with them, we partnered, and it was a bit of a coup to get this one called People in there that hadn't been there before. And you can see already how many communities are there that might be affected by this wind energy leasing. And there are 20 different communities that are affected. And then you can drill down the data a little bit and you can see, well, which community and what gear types. The black dots tell you Chatham, Massachusetts gill netters use that area over time. The gray dots tell you they used to use it, because one of the big things we're really interested in is temporal aspect to this data, and saying, well, it used to be really important to coastal Maine, even if they're not fishing it now. And you can start to map those areas that communities rely on and calculate percents overlap and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's typical GIS-y kind of things. But the point here is that it makes concrete this thing called community and this other thing called commons that simply don't previously exist. And what does that have to do with food systems? Well, I argue that recognizing community and commons is all about the ethics of small-scale fishing, the concerns of livelihood and community that can be made visible through these arrival metrology. So anyway, you've heard this before.
We haven't all heard it before. I haven't. That was fantastic. And it's so powerful to see it visualized and to just have a complete, like the rival metrology. I'm like, yes, that is amazing. Thank you so much. Was that the end of your, were you closing off there?
Yeah, that's
yeah, okay. Catherine's giving you a round of applause there. Does anyone, and Jenny as well? Yeah, I think people are very, very excited about this. Does anyone, any comments? Bhavya in the chat said this is so cool. I love it. Okay, I've got Emily and I've got Ethan. I don't know who was first, but go for it, Emily. Jump in.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Great to see you again and hear about this again. And I'm curious. My question has to do with kind of this notion of scale, because I love how you all are incorporating this into these, Northeastern portals. But I've been working with Lisa Campbell and Elizabeth Havis on, studying some of these things at the global level as we think about the UN Ocean Science Decade and some of the discourse around, the science we need for the oceans we want. And if you have any kind of creative ideas for how we might introduce this, because so much of the Ocean Science Decade discourse is filtering down to some of the local governance decisions, and how might we, use kind of these rival metrologies that you're developing to incorporate those up and incorporate those into kind of these global discussions about ocean science.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, what comes to mind is the sort of the singularity and the singularity really of there's something about the oceans that lets us imagine a sort of single answer that is applicable around the world, whereas like on terrestrial space, you have to admit that there are different kinds of economies, for example, or that there are different kinds of land uses, or there are different kinds of right? Like, but something about the oceans, it's like, oh, it's applicable in the ocean, across everywhere, which is to say, being attentive to the fact that the discourse of oceans management emerges from an incredibly specific place, which is the North Atlantic, pretty much somewhere between Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts and Bergen, Norway. Like this is the axis from which a form of science was produced that is the foundation for, I would argue, a really global science around measuring fish and presuming fishing behavior. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because like what I'm doing could be plugged in rivally everywhere else as well, because it's the same structure that they're using to measure fish and manage fish. So, pretty much everywhere they need the same kind of logbook data to count fish that I use to project communities. Do you see what I mean? So there's that potential of replicability across a whole bunch of sites, which was precisely the logic I used years ago when I was like doing this in some specific ports and I'm making maps for people. And then I'm like, whoa, I could do this for every single port up and down the entire coast. You know, you lose something, obviously, right? And the ethnographic moment and the participatory moment can't be for every single port up and down the coast, but you can still incorporate that in lots of interesting ways. So anyway, I guess I'm just pointing to that sort of singularity of the science and management project, kind of globally, yeah, and it's spread with, you know, blue growth.
Yeah, thanks. Sounds like you two have stuff to talk about, so it's good to me. You know, it sounds like you've already met, but you have more to talk about. Ethan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think this is related. I think I'm just I could listen to what you do endlessly, Kevin. I love it and I'm inspired by it. Um, I I think it's just the gap between seeing the potential that you're pointing to about the rival metrology. I believe in the power of that. And then trying to imagine, like from like where I sit, I look around and I see 1,000 spaces every day where a rival metrology would be transformative. And yet there's no institutional capacity in the place where I live to actually produce those things. And so I think, yeah, I guess in some ways it's just kind of like a practical question, but also just my own inner struggle of like seeing what, you know, imagining what's possible. And then like, I have no idea because I mean, I even try and make the argument for that to various people and it feels, you know, I think it needs more illustration, obviously, but it feels too abstract. It feels too, you know, I mean, the leftist materialists don't believe that a metrology matters that much. And, you know, then the other people just think it's like kind of fluffy foo-foo stuff. And because it does, you know, it doesn't use the categories that they've been told are the serious categories. And so I think it's just a question, like, I mean, if we're talking about regional food system governance, we actually need regional scaled metrologies across like every sector of livelihood that are doing what you're doing with fisheries. And I'm like, how can we do that in an organized way? You know, like it needs to happen across, I mean, since we're in the Northeast, it needs to happen across the Northeast because you know, that's hard work to do in one location. Like the aggregate data is actually really an important part of the power of it. So I guess that's just like a question for the community. Like,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks. I'm not exactly sure how to answer it. I mean, yeah, that kind of exceptionalism of fishing is useful, right? Because it's like, oh, there's one governing body for the entire massive area, and they do it this one way, you know, that and they have these particular gaps that they turn to me to fill. And in so doing, I offer them something they, you know, shakes them up a little bit. And I link it to environmental justice and da da da. You know, so it has that kind of, which doesn't exist everywhere, right? But maybe more conceptually, what I often think I'm doing is, you know, if we think of the state as equally, you know, decentered, like I'm trying to train the state to see what I want it to see, to do what I want it to do. You know, like if I could get it to see communities, maybe I could get those biologists to assess the actual sustainability of small scale fishing, which they're crazy about. How can we make fishing sustainable? Like if they could actually assess a more localized project and say, oh, that's actually much more sustainable than, you know, like, but you can't do that until they see it in terms of the data and in terms of a whole bunch of other. So I try to, yeah, that's again, not really an answer to your question, but maybe it's a parallel thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question to open up for our thinking, collective thinking. I've got Catherine Gibson and then Catherine McKinnon, and then we're going to move on to the next set of presentations. So over to you.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time. So I just feel like what you've done, Kevin, though, it would be great for us to think through what would be possible from the food point of view, like in terms of doing the different metrology, even if, yes, on the ground, at the moment it seems too abstract. I mean, I'm just thinking, what would it take to set up the kind of metrology that would actually be able to show how much decommodified food is actually supporting communities in the Northeast, for instance, to take a region and then think that through, even if as a thought experiment, at least for the community economies. And it's potentially something that could, be fundable, I suppose, as an idea that might then inform a different kind of policy. But yeah, it's really inspiring. Thanks.
Yeah, we will maybe hear a little bit about some of that work that's being done when Molly and Karen speak, because they've been working on regional stuff for a while. So, but there's more to do for sure. Catherine McKinnon, oh, there you go, you're on screen. Nice to see you.
Can everyone hear me all right? I'm on the highway, but I've pulled over. Kevin, it really just appreciation from me. So wonderful to hear your work so beautifully and clearly articulated today. It makes me, this idea of the replicability that serves the purpose of making the state see in ways that we want them to see, is fantastic. I'm working in the fisheries sector in the Solomon Islands and Timor-Leste. So it's a different kind of small scale fisheries, but there's a lot of what you're saying that translates across context. And one of the things that I think this work can counter is the tendency to want to find ways to impose that kind of universalizing fisheries management imaginary in a local context. So one thing that's happened in Timor is that they've taken an indigenous idea around, it's kind of been understood as creating taboo areas for fishing. And they've taken this, they've used the local language, and they're kind of imposing it in order to mean caps, right? It's the caps and trade approach imposed. But actually what that word really means is about a process that happens in community to discuss things that need managing, or conflicts that need resolving, or any tensions and issues, and is meant to be about much more of a collective, community-based resolution around things that are of issue. But instead, this language is being taken up by international NGOs, kind of imposed, and is in fact, the meaning of it is being shifted in place to adhere to what this international conventional approach is. So I just really wanted to appreciate the possibility of a different tool that makes different things visible in a way that is equally replicable, because you can't do that participatory slow process everywhere. I don't think I have a question in that.
That's okay.
Unless you have some thoughts to respond. I guess the question is, how do you see the work being applicable beyond that, the North American context and other parts of the world where small scale fishing is so important?
Yeah, I thank you for the comments and the question. I think it could happen in many places, even where you don't have a National Marine Fisheries Service collecting logbook data electronically and all this stuff, which is what even with what are any kind of data about where people fish can serve the purpose of creating a foundation that at least creates an imaginary of a kind of community territorialized space, rather than a space of individual actors and quantities of fish, right? So how do you, and there's lots of work done in fisheries that does that through mappings and other things. I guess I'm just trying to do it in a site where, that kind of inspiration of like mapping turfs in Indonesia and so on, that's always been an inspiration to me. And like, nobody's doing it in New England. How come we can't do it here, right? And then that becomes a much more data-driven project. But it's conceptually very similar, I would say. I'm not getting anywhere with that, but thanks.
I'm just conscious of the time, and with the really rich discussion bubbling up here, but I want to give Saideepa space to articulate your question. I think it's a really, really important one. And are you able to unmute? Do you want to share, Saideepa? You've written a couple of comments there. Oh, you're at an airport. Okay, she's on the road. All right. Well, we can all read what Saideepa's written in the chat, and she's raising that question of, what are the risks of making things more visible? Is there a risk of further commodification, reduction of value, and I would say like co-optation potentially? And sometimes things become too regulated. Saideepa says, I remember speaking to informal waste pickers in an Indian city. They asked us not to write about it as they could get evicted from the public land they were living in. So there's a tension there, definitely. I don't think we can figure it out right now, but it's definitely one to hold and think about more. I'm gonna move us along because I want to make sure that we've got time to now shift gears slightly. Thank you, Ethan, Penn, and Kevin for sharing your work, and I can see each of these as an arena for further exploration when we're thinking about governance and food systems governance. We're talking about the ontological basis of governance, how we might think about governance in diverse ways. Penn talking about like the tensions there between working in policy contexts and economic contexts that might narrow the scope of the kinds of liberatory efforts that we're trying to create, but yet people are working in these spaces and building alternatives. And Penn, Kevin, the rival metrologies and the mapping and the counter metrics, also a form and tool of mechanism of governing that's so important to bring to light and to have a conversation about. So far, we haven't talked too much about the region as an idea, and I think we're going to shift into that now. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Can everybody see that? Yay. Okay, great. So just shifting gears a bit now to kind of thinking, again, back to the impetus for this session, which is thinking about the regional food governance. And I think one of the guiding questions that I'd put in the chat that has also driven the seeding of this postdoc project that I'm just a month into, so we're still asking lots of questions, is, Molly Anderson, you framed this beautifully in one of our project meetings. What might a regional approach or perspective do for us in terms of thinking about transforming food governance? What is it about a regional scale as a strategy, thinking about scale as a strategy or as strategies? And what is it about this idea of a region? Now, of course, the region, we can think about that in a lot of different ways as well. And I think that we need to take a pluralistic and a polycentric approach to thinking about the region. Are we thinking about state territorial boundaries? Are we thinking about a bioregion? Are we thinking about an indigenous territories of governance? There's multiple ways of thinking about the region, and Jill Clark has done some really great work on this, a sort of pluricentric approach to thinking about governance of a region, and as well thinking about governance in a very diverse and pluricentric way. Multiple contested different kinds of governance. So this postdoc project is a partnership between the University of Vermont's Institute for Agroecology, and I wish Colin was here to say a bit more about what IFA does. I'm brand new, so I can't tell you too much other than, we're really focused on these kind of three pillars of transforming food systems for just sustainability, using participatory or mobilizing participatory transdisciplinary and action research, and equity is really at the center of the work that's being done at IFA. It's a fantastic team. I'm feeling super grateful to have been invited in. Everyone's just doing really exciting work, and the work is happening locally, regionally, and internationally as well. So there are a lot of international connections. So the postdoc itself is framed around this question of assessing the impact of food governance in the region, what has been done, what effects has this had, and what might it look like to work on transforming this through a PAR project. What we can do in 2 years, maybe 3 if we get more funding, is open to question. But that's where we're at right now. And we're looking at these frameworks of agroecology from the social movement sense as a political project of social transformation. Going back to what Ethan said about how do we live in relationship with land and earth others? So that's really the political impetus of agroecology, is transforming that. Again, another contested term that not everybody uses. And then we're also thinking about, where do human rights, or might human rights, come into this? So I don't have a lot to say on those things now, but that's just to frame the project. And then we're really lucky to be partnering with Food Solutions New England. Karen's going to speak about this more in a minute, but this is already working at the regional level around a shared set of values to kind of build capacity and build conversation and connection around these values of democratic empowerment, racial equity and dignity for all, sustainability and trust. So I'm going to leave my part there, and I'm going to hand over to Molly now. Molly's going to talk a bit about some of the work that's already being done at the regional level, and then pass over to Karen, and we'll hopefully still have some time for questions and comments and discussion at the end. It's been great so far. So I'm going to manage the slides for our team here. And Molly, I'll pass over to you. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and kick off.
Great. I'm going to be quick because I really would love to have some discussion on this. The discussion so far has been wonderful in this session. I'm Molly Anderson. I'm a faculty member at Middlebury College in Vermont, professor of food studies. And I want to start out with why we're using a regional focus here. Regionalism has become more and more important, more and more recognized as a way to be looking at food systems in New England. And there have been a lot of organizations created that are indeed regional across New England. Sometimes this is because solutions to the problems that we're dealing with benefit from economies of scale, and a regional scope allows for a wider region from which to draw food supplies. This is the reason why FINE, which is Farm to Institution New England, was formed. New England covers many different microclimates. So when food is ripe, available at one part of the region, it might not be ready to harvest in another region. So we can have exchanges across the region. And in addition, only some states have coastal access. So seafood from those states can be transported to the landlocked states. Another group that I work with, Red Tomato, started out as a regional group serving fruit growers in New England. And now it's expanded to a national scale with partnerships in Georgia and California. A second reason that these regional organizations have been created is because of similarities across the New England states. And this might not be obvious at all to those of you from the antipodes, but the settlement patterns, the history, the people who came in and did the settling, the cultures, the relations, very tense in most cases, with indigenous people, a hilly and mountainous terrain with a lack of large stretches of arable land, except in northern Maine, and town governance patterns are quite similar across New England. And our food-related concerns are quite similar too. A lack of affordable farmland, a short growing season, a lack of affordable housing for farmers and farm workers, long distances from the sites of production, generally in northern New England, down to the main consumer centers in Boston, New York, Providence, Rhode Island. This has led to the creation of Food Solutions New England, also the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, which is trying to get more land into the hands of BIPOC people, and the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, And also it's led to information exchanges across the region. We have a regional listserv that also posts jobs that are related to food and agriculture. A third reason why a regional approach is appropriate is that a lot of the solutions to food system problems can be implemented much more effectively across state boundaries, allowing states to cooperate instead of to compete. For a long time, each state had its own locally grown, and they were basically competing. But I think they're trying to cooperate much more. One way that this cooperation happens is through New England gatherings of state agricultural commissioners who share information and try to figure out how they can work together better. One of the things that's really crucial for effective work across the region is having a vision of the kind of food system that we want. We need that to inspire us and to keep us moving in alignment toward that vision. The vision may never be realized. It may be purely aspirational, but it keeps people pointed in the same direction. This business of alignment and being pointed in the same direction, to me, is even more important in the wake of our recent election, where we saw so much polarization. Despite this polarization, there is a core group in New England that wants an environmentally sound and racially just region that respects the right to healthy food for all and wants to restore vibrant communities with strong farming and fishing economies. So this is what we're building around for our vision. A group of people who included Brian Donahue, who was then at Brandeis University, Russell Libby, who was then the executive director of MAFCA in Maine. They traveled to Spinokia, which is a amazing kind of educational site for farming in Tuscany. They went there for a workshop. They looked around at the Tuscan landscape of small family farms, these beautiful vineyards, and they wondered, why can't New England look like this? And that was the beginning of the New England Food Vision, which was published in 2014. And this is the cover of the New England Food Vision. The food vision was based on a set of core values. And if you could advance to the next slide, Anissa, these are the core values: food rights, healthy eating, sustainability, and community vitality. This is what we were working for throughout the food system activities. We added fisheries rather late in the game, which was a shame because it really was not as well represented as land-based agriculture in the food system vision. And as I get into where we're going next, I'll say that we really want to uplift the role of fisheries in all of these things: food rights, healthy eating, sustainability, and community vitality. And I'm thinking, Kevin, maybe you have a role in this vision. The vision posed 3 scenarios: business as usual, what we called omnivore's delight, and regional reliance, and calculated the amount of land that was required to grow our food in the region under each of these scenarios. We also calculated separate diets for each scenario with decreasing amounts of meat being consumed. We vetted the vision with large groups at food summits, which were one of the things that Food Solutions New England was doing early on, food summits in every state. We roused a lot of enthusiasm. People loved the idea of a tangible goal, and they really liked being able to play with these scenarios to raise more or less of specific crops in under each scenario. Food Solutions New England hosted the vision and created graphics that were focused on the idea of 50 by 60, 50% of New England's food, or I should say the monetary value of New England's food being achieved in the region by the year 2060. So this catchy 50 by 60 became a slogan that Food Solutions New England was trying to promote. But subsequently, people in the region decided 2060 is way too far in the future to keep people motivated for continuous change. So a new project started up, New England Feeding New England, that was initiated to look at what we could achieve by 2030. And if you could go to that next slide, this is the homepage for New England Feeding New England. And there's several reports available for this. It's the project is pretty much wrapped up its formative stage of collecting data about markets and demand and what the capacity is throughout the region to feed ourselves. 30% of the food by the year 2030. So that's where we've gone with New England Feeding New England. And this idea has been picked up by all the different states. They seem to be enthusiastic, but neither of these projects has a vision of exactly how regional governance is going to work. Remember, governance in New England is state by state. And we actually did not do that intentionally. We thought policies needed to be determined at the state level, and we didn't want to be prescriptive. We were afraid that would really turn people off. But the NEFNI team, New England Feeding New England, got buy-in, and I think we're ready to move forward to what kind of governance might make this possible, this vision of 30% of the monetary value of our food being achieved by 2030. What these projects tell us is that there's enthusiasm for regional food supply and a strong potential to increase the amounts of food that are being produced regionally if we can increase the amount of land that's being dedicated to farmland, which is one of the reasons that what Ethan is doing is really super interesting to me. And I'm part of a commons group in Vermont. We'll need to not only increase the number of farms, but we also need to increase the marketing options for local and regional food. So I'll leave my part there and turn things over to Karen.
Thank you, Molly. And Anissa, you will forward the slide, correct? Oh, that's sort of the goals of the New England Feeding New England project, which is a project of the New England State Food System Planners Partnership. So food system planners from each state come together around meeting those goals. But the next slide is where I will begin. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Karen Nordstrom, and I co-direct what is called the Integrated Regional Policy Program at Food Solutions New England. And I believe, Ethan, you know my counterpart, Alex Redfield, who's located in Portland, Maine, whereas I am over here in Burlington, Vermont, on the unceded land of the Abenaki. And through my work with this program, I serve as a research affiliate with the Regional Governance Project at the UVM Institute for Agroecology. So what I wanted to do today was to build on Molly's insights about the regional vision and share a bit about how we're sort of operationalizing that and working to transform food system governance in New England. So just to sort of briefly reiterate from what Molly said, the 6 states have historically operated independently on food policy, despite sharing common challenges, such as those associated with land access and market development. And if it hasn't been said already, this partnership that Molly mentioned has recently completed a local foods count, which is demonstrating that less than 10% of the food that is produced or consumed in New England is produced in New England. So basically stating that 90% of our food is coming from outside sources, creating fragmentation around regional resilience. And while this is the case, it's also catalyzed innovative approaches to regional coordination that connect a complex web of stakeholders, from farmers and fishers to indigenous communities and state agencies, which are each operating within distinct rural, urban, and maritime contexts. So this diversity demands sophisticated governance approaches that can honor both local autonomy while building regional coherence. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. So in the case of my work, when we talk about transforming food systems governance, we're fundamentally reimagining how decisions are made and implemented across our region. So building on this foundational work of Food Solutions New England, we're taking this transformation to the next level through the New England Integrated Policy Program, which is in partnerships with wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities, which is a 6-state regional network focused largely on land conservation and forestry. So this transformation is anchored in a commitment to uplifting community solutions through participatory processes and action research, where solutions emerge from community needs and lived experience. Rather than imposing top-down policies, we're building targeted connections among advocates, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to co-create governance approaches that bridge traditional silos and power dynamics. And while I say all this, I just want to point out that we are still in the early stages of being a program. Alex and I have been working together for just over a year. I've been working with FSNE for almost 3 years. And so as I'm sharing this, I'm also seeking some feedback and about sort of ways in which you could foresee how this could be useful and how we might advance some of this work moving forward. So basically the way we're looking at this is through the lens of what we're calling an integrated landscape seascape approach that operates within what we're calling the 4 Fs framework, which is food, farms, fisheries, and forests. And by leveraging diverse networks, we aim to spark solidarity across sectors and maintain cross-sector participatory processes. The framework, combined with our focus on supporting integrated conversations, allows us to create a foundation for values-centered local policies while amplifying pathways to interstate and regional audiences, ultimately increasing our effectiveness in developing multi-state solutions that advance land and water conservation, improve food systems, and benefit all in society. So next slide, please. So we operate through several key mechanisms, each supported by concrete initiatives. First, as a 6-state regional hub, our intention is to facilitate robust network connections that bring together diverse stakeholders, involving active engagement with state-level policy coalitions, from the Maine Food Policy Working Group to the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. These councils and coalitions intersect with the New England Food System Planning Partnership, that group that is leading the New England Feeding New England initiative focused on food supply chain resilience. And through these and many other connections, we aim to convene a New England 4F policy coordination working group to help ensure alignment and cooperation across sectors that traditionally work in isolation. So that's one part of our work. Second, we serve as both a regional integrator of environmental and social issues and a collective think tank through strategic research partnerships. Our collaboration with the UVM Institute for Agroecology through this particular regional governance project exemplifies this approach. And currently we have found one of the key intersections through some of these conversations has focused on equitable farmland access. And that's really bringing us together with wildlands and woodlands to ensure that our research directly addresses community needs while building evidence for effective regional solutions across that landscape, seascape perspective. So third, as a thought leader in the region, we develop and share practical policy tools through multiple outputs. These include regular policy syntheses and updates, collaborative issue briefs, our policy solutions webinar series. We facilitate convenings, conversations, and listening sessions while producing detailed reports, working on position papers and research. And our focus on narrative framing and strategic communication as a key impact area of FSNE ensures that these insights reach and resonate with key stakeholders. What we think makes this approach powerful is how it bridges theoretical frameworks with practical implementation. So for example, our work on farmland access is being undertaken in concert with organizations like the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School, and demonstrates integration of theory to action as we're working together with them to simultaneously address land transfer mechanisms, conservation approaches, and equity barriers faced by farmers. So next slide, please. And here I'll just briefly share specific examples of how this approach is translating into action. To date, we've been partnering with the Northeast Healthy Soil Network on a campaign for climate resilience, producing accessible policy syntheses, aiming to inform regional advocacy efforts by getting this out through policy solutions webinars and such. And this collaboration demonstrates how our framework can address complex challenges such as farm viability and biodiversity conservation that cross traditional sector boundaries. So, and then through the webinar series, we're bringing together diverse stakeholders to tackle these issues. Things like alternative financing for regenerative agriculture is our most recent brief and upcoming policy solutions webinar. And we've done things also like integrating climate resilience with food security goals, drawing on the expertise of practitioners across our networks and across scales, from those who have developed state food security plans to those involved in crafting international reports. And just to say that these aren't standalone outputs, but they're really more about coordinated elements of our broader strategy to transform regional food system governance. So to close, I just wanted to sort of reiterate that we believe that this regional approach is essential because food system challenges don't stop at political boundaries. Through our integrated framework, we aim to demonstrate how regional coordination can create more resilient and equitable outcomes while respecting local autonomy and knowledge. So with that, I'm really particularly interested in hearing your perspective on how this approach to transformation might resonate with your own work, what elements of this participatory regional framework could be most valuable within your own context, and what insights from your experience could help us to strengthen our collective approach.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, Molly. I'm conscious of time. I want to open it up to the room to see if anyone's got comments, questions, reflections. I think one of the things that in our conversations that early conversations that we've been having so far, Molly and Karen, you both shared that, and this is an incredible amount of work that's being done, all this, the kind of mapping and the metrics of what are the land use patterns and what would it take to produce, 50% of the value of food in the region that's consumed in the region. But you also mentioned that some of these reports, they're taking kind of a narrow productivist approach, and it's a little bit too focused on production, how much food is going to get produced, and then some of those other questions about power, really, and about who's growing this food, how is it being grown, what kind of production models are being used, who's governing the land, how, so many questions that arise from this that I think you're interested and we're interested in digging into a bit further. Just wanted to share that. Does anyone want to jump in? It'd be great to hear some responses.
I see Catherine McKinnon's hand.
Oh yeah, thanks, Molly. Go ahead, Catherine.
Sorry, I was just trying to find somewhere to pull over again. So wonderful to hear about this initiative. Thank you so much. As I was listening, I was thinking back over the other talks this morning, or this evening for you guys, that we've had, and it strikes me that each one of the speakers today is speaking from and about a slightly different ontology of transformation, and I'm curious to get some of the reflections from every one of the speakers around that. I mean, so just to contrast Ethan's work to your presentation just now, there's a sense very much that transformation begins in visioning in what you just presented. It begins in that thinking about the future that we want and kind of working backwards from there is what it sounds like. So then you have a vision, and then you look at how do we implement and operationalize that vision. And it's a different thing to what Ethan's describing in the work that he's undertaking with the community, where it's very much, I mean, Ethan, I don't know, it sounds like it's very much a here and now. It's what's in front of us. How do we have this conversation here and now and in the way we want to have it? And also the second speaker, I'm sorry I didn't quite catch the name, but that idea of worlding. So it's a here and now thing. It's not so much a focus on what's the vision and how do we get there. So there's a different temporality and a different ontology of change across these different presentations. And I'm curious to hear if you have some reflections on that yourselves.
Great
Could
comments.
I
Yeah,
jump in?
yeah, please do. Please do.
Yeah, Catherine, I really appreciate that. And yeah, I'm thinking about similar things, and I guess I'm seeing this conversation as like a potentially really fruitful space, because I think those three, I mean, to be crude, like if you're sort of naming, like there's a visioning approach, there's like a metrology approach that Kevin was talking about, and then there's this very sort of like building from practice approach that I think is where our work with land and commons coming from, a lot of the work that Penn was referring to. And I mean, I see all those three things as crucial parts of the, the broader work that we're doing. And I'm not so sure that that's where the tension or difference is. I think to me, there's a question about ontology, like what are our basic assumptions about what the world is made of and what categories we're using to approach things? Because all those three different categories could look really different depending on kind of what our starting point is there. And to me, that's where I think work in diverse economies, diverse livelihoods, solidarity economy, and like the food systems New England work, I think there's a lot of rich conversation there to see, like, how would changing our assumptions about what the world is made of, or what the basic categories that we're using to analyze things, how would changing those assumptions shift the kinds of visioning we do, the kinds of things we measure, or the kinds of practices that we make visible or decide to support. And I think there's a real tension between using the dominant categories that everybody wants, everybody's trained to use. Like, for me, my hobby horse is like economy, society, and environment is the thing that everybody wants to divide the world into. And I see that as a really ultimately destructive way of thinking and organizing. And so what happens if we start from a different set of categories? So I feel like this is the start of some really exciting potential for exploring all that together to see where that could go.
Thanks, Ethan. Does anyone want to respond to that or say anything?
Can you see Catherine's hand up?
Yeah.
You'll go for it, Catherine. Jump in. Thank you.
And it's funny as the coordinator, you can't see any of our hands going up.
I know.
Again, I agree. It is a wonderful conversation that I hope can go on. But I was thinking back to where you started, Ethan, on permanent land connections and what it means to think relationally in land and what that might mean in the New England area. And the thought that came up to me was, what could we learn from First Nations, Indigenous peoples' food kind of system? Like, how did they survive the winter? I have no idea what it is that they did to be able to live in that land over the whole year, and what could we learn from that for our food system? Because it seems like we're kind of, we could just think of the business as usual. We're going to keep eating avocados whenever we want to, or strawberries whenever we want to, etc. And we're going to try and make our food system do that somehow. Or, we really take surviving well together in a different way in terms of living in this world in a different way. How do we start to think very differently about what we eat, when we eat it, how much we eat, and how do we deal with the long winter, etc. I know it seems totally abstract and everything, but it just seemed to me, how do we do that shift to a different perspective? And could we make ourselves think about those things and get insights from Indigenous landowners and livers in that environment to help us do that? Anyway, it's a kind of a wacky thought, but that's what came up for me when thinking about the region, which, a region, something I've been very concerned about and interested in for a long time. But if we really take this idea of relationality to the land, what would it mean to think about that region of New England? And to me, the big winter is one of the things that would confront me most.
Those are really good questions. And obviously, we need to be eating more seasonally, eating the food that grows locally, and eating more of the wild foods that are abundant here. I remember looking at a list of the foods that the Wabanaki lived on, and it's a long list of plants that we never eat. Sumpweed, cattails. We just don't even think of those as things to eat, but there's so many things that we could be eating. It also means preserving a lot more food, and that's what the indigenous people did. They dried and smoked a lot of the fish and meat, so they had something to live on through that long winter. And you're absolutely right. It's a pretty harsh and unforgiving environment. Others?
I would like to just really quickly jump in, and what's coming up for me is around the listening. So listening to the land, listening to all people. And I think the reason that comes up for me is because of some more recent work that Food Solutions New England has actually been involved with the Conscious Food Systems Alliance, that's talking about consciousness approaches to transformation and recognizing the inner dimensions, that our own inner dimensions of transformation are very much connected to collective transformation. So this kind of, to me, gets back to some of the ontological thinking around like worldviews and sort of the ways in which we're relating. The ways that we relate then inform those worldviews, and kind of brings me back, Catherine, to thinking just broadly about some of the ways in which Food Solutions New England, through the narrative work, through the policy and governance work, through the racial equity work, it's sort of like holistically intended to be sort of falls within this umbrella, I think, of education that's also visionary, right? That has, and we've been talking about a revision to be completed in a very different way, given all that we've learned in the last 10 years since the first vision. So, for me, someone who's very inspired and new to this network and sort of taking in and ways of thinking about how to engage with governance in ways that will create a vision that is equitable and provides for different ways of thinking, being, and knowing.
I might just briefly jump in here. We're going to have to wrap up, I think, in a moment. But I just would like to say that in the context of this project, what I've been thinking about a lot is things that I learned from working in an international, transnational movement space with social movements, peasant movements, indigenous peoples, feminist movements, mostly from the global south, women, youth, people who are working in urban contexts, and how we were working on this on these principles and practices of facilitating participation. And in that context, it was about how can those of us with, more access to resources, namely academics, NGOs in the global north, open space and support those on the front lines to directly self-represent in these policy spaces. And that, I think, taught me so much about building solidarity and how we might be able to work together to, in a reflexive sense, really think about the ways that power relations are reproduced through practices, and how do we build liberatory practices in the very concrete actions that we do day to day. So in the context of this project, how we organize a revisioning process, who do we bring in to do the agenda setting right at the beginning, is crucially important, rather than setting out an agenda and a plan and then asking people to input into that. How do we create an agenda setting process that really brings in Indigenous folks that are already working on these issues, farmers of color networks that are already existing in these regions, community fishers, and so on, youth movements and youth organizations. So I'm pretty excited to think about that with our crew and with all of you here. I think we've unless there's somebody's got a burning question or comment or yeah, okay, everyone's smiling.
Kath's hand is still up.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
It was supposed to be lowered, sorry.
Oh, Kath's oh yeah.
I forgot to lower it. But
Look
I
at your
just wanted
hands
to, can I just say thank you so much, Anissa, for bringing us all together, and also congratulations on being a Dr. Madden now. It's wonderful to see you going back to the US and invigorating everybody over there. It's wonderful to have so many people connecting through this session. And I hope many of you will look to some of the other Liviana sessions that have been held over the last 2 weeks, some of which have been, or all of which have been absolutely fantastic. But I know there hasn't been a lot of headspace for people in the US to think about Liviana in the last few days. But I just want a vote of thanks to you, Anissa, for bringing us all together. And I love to see this conversation going further because it's so rich, and wonderful to meet Molly and Karen, and all the best with this next new directions that you're going. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for being here and taking the time to think with us. And yeah, I think this is really just the beginning of a conversation that we're going to keep working together on. So last session for Liviana, like yay to everybody. Amazing. We did it. We got through. And it's Friday night for us. It's Saturday afternoon for lots of other people here. I don't know what time of day it is elsewhere, but enjoy the evening, the afternoon, and we'll all be in touch. The recording will be up on the website at some point. So
Jenny's already put it in the playlist there for Liviana in the chat. So any of the, including wonderful keynote by Bhavya, who's also here with us. So please go and look at it anytime you want.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.